Diane Carter stepped into the school auditorium as if she owned every inch of the polished floors and glittering chandeliers above. Her stride was measured, precise, each step echoing softly in the high-ceilinged lobby. She had prepared for this room countless times in her mind. The murmurs, the sideways glances, the judgments cloaked in politeness. Yet nothing, no scenario could dull the sharp sting of that first collective look. The eyes found her the instant she crossed the threshold. Her mother paused mid-conversation, eyebrows raised, whispering, "Does she even go here?" Another father leaned slightly forward, lips twitching in a smirk, nodding to his friend, as if to say, "Watch this." From behind the registration table, a clerk's head tilted just enough to betray surprise, their fingers hesitating over the touchscreen. Not a word had been spoken, and yet they had already decided where she belonged. Or rather, where they assumed she didn't. She adjusted the strap of her navy leather bag, her cream blouse catching the soft glow of the chandelier. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek, professional bun, nothing loose to distract from her presence. Every inch of her posture radiated authority, confidence, and unshakable calm. She did not flinch at the whispers, the sideways glances, the thinly veiled smirks. She had been here before, in countless spaces that weren't designed for someone who looked like her, spaces where she had been underestimated, dismissed, ignored, spaces that would later learn to fear her influence. At the registration table, the clerk finally cleared their throat. "Name?" they asked, voice clipped, almost defensive. Diane didn't hesitate. She said it calmly, deliberately, as though each syllable mattered. Diane Carter. The clerk's fingers froze over the tablet, their brow knitting as if the name itself was unfamiliar, impossible. They looked up, meeting her eyes, and for a brief second there was a flicker of realization, an acknowledgement that this wasn't a parent who could be casually ignored. Parents continued to murmur behind her, assessing her attire, her demeanor, her very existence. "She seems different. Not really part of this school vibe. Do you think she even has kids here?" Every word, every whisper, found its way to her ears. Not because she sought it, but because she had long since developed a radar for prejudice, the subtle ways in which assumptions about black women manifest in elite spaces. She had learned early that perception could be manipulated, that spaces would try to define you before you spoke. And she had learned just as quickly how to reclaim those spaces without saying a word. Meanwhile, the other parents around her moved in their usual rituals of wealth and comfort, exchanging business cards, commenting on children's attire, patting each other on the back for minor achievements, oblivious to the silent scrutiny they were levying on her. Some nodded politely, but the distinction was clear. She was an anomaly. A disruption to the invisible hierarchy that had taken decades to cultivate. Diane moved through the lobby with quiet precision. She approached the check-in counter, fingers brushing over her notes, a subtle reminder that she had come prepared. This was not a social visit. She had been invited for a purpose that would challenge every assumption made in the room. They thought she didn't belong. They had no idea who they were looking at, or how the room would shift once she took her place. Parents whispered behind her back, glances following as she found her seat near the front of the auditorium. The chair was unassuming, but for her it was a vantage point. She set her bag down, neatly arranging her materials, reviewing notes she had prepared with precision. Her hands were steady, movements deliberate. Her presence alone demanded attention, though few would openly acknowledge it, at least not yet. The room continued to buzz with low-level chatter, yet there was a tension in the air, a subtle current that even the oblivious parents could not entirely mask. Some stared openly, curious, uncertain, as if trying to reconcile the reality of her existence with their own assumptions about the people who belonged in this space. She didn't react to their judgment. She didn't correct their ignorance. Instead, she let it hang in the air, letting the whispers, the half-smiles, the sideways stares do the heavy lifting for the story that would soon unfold. She had learned that patience could be as powerful as confrontation, that quiet control often leaves a louder impression than noise ever could. By the end of the evening, those whispers wouldn't just be silenced. They would be forced to confront everything they had assumed about her. She pulled out her notebook, fingers tracing the edges of the paper. She glanced at the stage, imagining the moment she would step into the spotlight, the precise way she would command the room. Not arrogance, not performative authority, but the kind of presence that only comes from mastery, knowledge, and years of proving oneself in spaces where every expectation is stacked against you. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon. You don't want to miss how Diane Carter turns this room upside down. She adjusted her glasses, a subtle motion that caught the light just so, signaling attentiveness and intellect. Every detail mattered. How she carried herself, how she positioned her materials, even the way she breathed. It all spoke volumes before a single word had left her lips. Parents continued to murmur, some distracted by their programs, others glancing around, assessing who might be seated next to them. Yet no one could ignore the quiet command of her presence. And in that moment, the room, every whispering, judging eye in the auditorium, was unknowingly waiting for her to take control. They thought she was just another parent. They had no idea that this same black woman would soon hold the attention of the entire room and reshape how they saw her in every way. Diane Carter moved through the auditorium like she belonged to every corner of it, though every eye seemed determined to remind her she didn't. Parents murmured as she passed, their whispers a delicate but sharp chorus. She seems different, not really part of this school vibe. Do you think she even has kids here? Each comment hung in the air, a subtle declaration that she was an outsider, a puzzle they couldn't fit into their neatly ordered world. She heard everything, not because she was eavesdropping, but because she had long since developed the instinct to detect every undercurrent in a room where she was not assumed to belong. The laughter behind hands, the careful avoidance of her gaze, the brief, sidelong stares, they all told the same story. This space was not meant for someone like her. And yet, she did not shrink. She did not falter. Diane's presence itself was a statement. Medium dark skin glowing subtly under the warm lighting, her navy blazer crisply tailored, her cream blouse precise and understated. Hair pulled back into a sleek bun, glasses perched lightly on her nose. Everything about her spoke of meticulous care, intelligence and authority. Her stride was calm, her posture commanding without demanding attention, her hands holding her notes with quiet assurance. Every subtle detail was intentional. She understood the power of presence in spaces where assumptions about black women ran deep. Around her, the parents continued their rituals of social affirmation. They complimented each other's children, exchanged business cards, laughed at in-jokes. They smiled warmly at each other while she passed, oblivious to the silent judgments they had cast. Their eyes lingered, sometimes in curiosity, more often in thinly veiled skepticism. For many, her very existence disrupted the invisible hierarchy they had carefully curated. As she found her seat near the front of the auditorium, a few of the whispers softened, replaced by glances of cautious appraisal. Diane did not react. She placed her bag neatly beside her chair, opened her notebook, and began reviewing her notes with deliberate calm. She let the murmurs, the judgments, and the subtle side-eye linger. Let them make themselves comfortable in the false confidence that they understood her. She had learned to let silence do the work that confrontation rarely could. By the end of the evening, those whispers would turn into stunned silence, and some would even wish they had kept their mouths shut. As she settled in, a few parents tried to gauge her role. A mother leaned over her friend, whispering, "Do you think she's a guest speaker or just visiting?" The friend shrugged, eyebrows raised. Others whispered about her attire, her calm, quiet confidence, and the way she carried herself, small details that betrayed their assumptions about education, wealth, and taste. They tried to classify her, to slot her into a category they could understand. They failed. Meanwhile, Diane's mind was already on the stage. She had prepared for this moment with precision, every word measured, every example tested against clarity and impact. She knew the power of narrative, of commanding attention without raising her voice. Every glance that followed her, every muted judgment, was simply a reminder that the room was ready to be changed. The subtle microaggressions continued. A group of parents huddled near the back, glancing in her direction and making speculative comments about her children, her income, even her manner of speaking. "I don't think she fits in with the other parents," one said, voice quiet but sharp. "She seems intense." Diane could hear it all, yet she didn't flinch. Instead, she adjusted the corner of her notebook, fingers brushing over the edge with quiet composure, and allowed the room to stew in its assumptions. In these moments, she was acutely aware of the pattern. Every space where black women are not assumed to belong shares a familiar rhythm, the whispered judgments, the invisible measures of worth, the constant testing of presence. She had navigated them all, and she knew that soon the balance would shift. Soon, the room would have to recalibrate, and the ones who had whispered would be forced to confront their own assumptions. Her calm focus was magnetic, though unnoticed by those lost in their own social signalling. Other parents continued their polite networking, oblivious to the silent tension she carried with her. They smiled, complimented, and nodded at each other, but Diane's attention was on the future, on the stage, on the words she would speak, on the moment when authority, intellect, and presence would collide in a way that could not be ignored. Every whisper, every sideways glance, every judgmental eye in this room would soon be powerless against the force Diane Carter was about to unleash. She glanced at the stage, visualizing the steps she would take, the way the microphone would meet her presence, and the silence that would follow her first words. Every detail mattered. Her voice would carry, her gestures would punctuate, and every parent who had doubted her would be forced to confront what they had missed in their shallow assessments. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon. You won't want to miss how Diane Carter flips this room upside down and silences every doubt. Even as the whispers persisted, a subtle shift began. Parents who had been distracted by their own judgments now stole glances, curiosity piercing their assumptions. Some leaned forward slightly in their seats, wondering if the murmurs about her role were correct. The room, unknowingly, was priming itself for the moment when she would walk on stage. A room about to be held captive not by spectacle, but by intellect, presence, and undeniable authority. By the time she spoke, the same parents who had whispered and judged would realize they had miscalculated entirely, and it would be too late to undo their mistake. Diane adjusted her glasses one last time, smooth and deliberate, and let her hands rest on her notebook. Every breath, every small movement spoke of control, focus, and quiet confidence. The whispers, the judgments, the microaggressions, all of it would soon be absorbed, reframed, and eclipsed by her presence on that stage. The announcement came through the quiet hum of the auditorium like a lightning strike. Now we welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Diane Carter. For a fraction of a second, the room froze. Parents who had whispered behind programs, who had judged her from the moment she stepped in, instinctively glanced around. Faces palmed subtly, a few covered their mouths with hands, as if to stifle surprise. Others exchanged glances, murmuring softly, "I didn't know." All assumptions made in hushed tones about her place, her status, her belonging, were about to collide with reality. Diane Carter rose from her seat near the front with the same calm authority she carried through life. Medium dark skin, radiant under the warm auditorium lighting, a sleek navy blazer perfectly fitted over a cream blouse, hair styled in a polished bun, and glasses catching the soft reflection of the chandelier above. Every movement intentional, measured, and commanding without arrogance. She held her notes lightly, the corners resting against her fingertips. The air seemed to pause as she began her walk to the stage. They had whispered, judged, and dismissed her. In just a few steps, all of that would be irrelevant. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor, each step echoing in the silence that had fallen over the audience. Parents shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, some sitting rigidly, caught between surprise and curiosity. The murmurs that had followed her in the lobby and through the aisles now fell away, replaced by the magnetic presence she radiated, a presence that demanded attention without asking for it. The principal stepped aside with a subtle nod, allowing her the center of the stage. Diane approached the microphone and adjusted it with a deliberate hand, her fingers brushing over the sleek metal as she centered herself. She didn't rush. She allowed the room to acknowledge her presence, letting the anticipation build. This was not theatrics. This was mastery. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear, confident, and resonant. "I am honored to speak with you today about the wonders of the human brain." A ripple ran through the auditorium. Gasps, murmurs, and startled glances swept the room. Parents who had assumed she didn't belong, who had made snap judgments about her appearance, her attire, and her very existence, were now forced to listen. Truly listen. Her words were precise but warm, filled with authority and approachability. She spoke of neurons and synapses, memory and learning, illustrating complex concepts with clarity and accessibility. Her research, her insights, her eloquence, all revealed the depth of intellect that some had doubted could exist in someone they had underestimated. Everything they assumed about her, intelligence, status, influence, was about to be dismantled in real time. Diane's gestures were minimal but deliberate. A subtle movement of the hand to emphasize a point, a tilt of the head to engage the audience, a measured pause that let her words sink in. The room, once buzzing with judgmental energy, now hung on every sentence. The whispers had vanished. All that remained was attention, full, undivided and compelled. Parents who had whispered behind their hands now found themselves captivated. Their curiosity replaced skepticism. Their assumptions were dissolving with every example she shared, every insight she delivered. She wasn't here to perform. She was here to educate, to illuminate, and to assert her rightful presence. The same parents who thought she was out of place were now powerless, caught entirely in the gravity of her voice and her mind. Halfway through her keynote, Diane paused, allowing a moment of reflection. She scanned the room slowly, eyes meeting those who had earlier judged her. Medium dark skin glowing under the stage lights, glasses reflecting the chandeliers, poised and calm. She allowed a subtle, confident smile to curve her lips, not arrogance, but certainty. A parent shifted uncomfortably, realizing too late that they had misjudged her. The auditorium had transformed. It was no longer a room divided by whispered prejudice. It was a space commanded by her intellect and presence. Every eye focused, every mind engaged. Every assumption made about black women in elite spaces, about belonging, authority and respect, was being quietly but powerfully challenged. If you're watching, hit subscribe and the bell icon right now. You do not want to miss how Diane Carter's presence will leave this room forever changed. Diane continued, her voice unwavering, each sentence building upon the last. She told stories of neuroscience breakthroughs, shared anecdotes that revealed her expertise, and wove her research into lessons everyone could grasp. Her eloquence was not performative. It was the embodiment of years of work, knowledge, and perseverance. Every parent, every educator, every observer in that room had no choice but to acknowledge her authority. Those who once questioned her presence now understood she had always belonged, and she was here to show them exactly why. By the time she reached the closing segment of her speech, the transformation in the room was complete. Parents who had silently judged were now leaning in, captivated and reflective. Some shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that assumptions about race, status, and intellect are often wrong. Others were nodding in admiration, realizing the privilege of witnessing brilliance firsthand. Diane Carter finished her keynote with poise, a final commanding statement that tied her message together with clarity, authority, and inspiration. She adjusted her glasses one last time, nodded to the audience, and stepped back from the microphone, leaving the room in a charged silence, a silence that spoke volumes. She didn't shout. She didn't demand recognition. She simply reminded them why assumptions about black women in elite spaces always fall short. The audience erupted into applause, tentative at first, then swelling into full, thunderous approval. Parents who had judged her earlier clapped, some awkwardly, some with awe, but all acknowledging the power, authority, and intellect they had underestimated. Diane Carter had walked onto a stage that was never built for her, or so they thought, and turned the room upside down. Medium dark skin glowing, navy blazer immaculate, every gesture deliberate, she left an indelible mark. A reminder that presence, intelligence, and authority are undeniable when wielded with confidence and purpose. Diane Carter had stepped down from the stage, her keynote concluded, yet the auditorium remained alive with the echo of her presence. The applause wasn't polite or obligatory. It was thunderous, cascading like a wave through the room. Parents who had whispered, judged, and doubted her just an hour ago now clapped, some awkwardly, others with visible awe. The energy had shifted entirely. For a moment, the room seemed suspended in disbelief. The same parents who had smirked, whispered, and exchanged knowing looks were now frozen, staring, trying to process the authority, intellect, and eloquence they had underestimated. The assumptions that had followed her from the lobby, whispered behind hands and between teeth, had collapsed under the weight of her presence. Diane smiled politely, a subtle curve of her lips, graceful and understated. She thanked the principal, acknowledged the audience, and walked toward the exit with measured steps. Every motion, the sway of her blazer, the confidence in her stride, the calm poise of her hands, reminded the room that she had always belonged. They had judged her in a single glance. And now, every whispered doubt was being replaced by undeniable respect. As she moved through the aisles, some parents whispered apologies under their breath, embarrassed by the assumptions they had made. Others simply stared, trying to reconcile the confident, brilliant woman before them with the image they had constructed in their minds, a misjudgment born from bias and unexamined prejudice. Diane didn't pause for recognition, nor did she need to. Her presence was recognition enough. She could see the subtle shifts, a mother nudging her child to pay closer attention, a father leaning forward as if to better understand her words, a handful of students scribbling notes furiously. Her impact wasn't just personal, it was generational, educational, cultural. The room had transformed from a space of judgment into a space of engagement, and she had orchestrated it without a single raised voice. Diane Carter's expertise as a neuroscientist had commanded their attention, yes, but it was the calm authority with which she carried herself that truly dismantled their assumptions. Medium dark skin, sleek navy blazer, perfectly styled hair, poised gestures, every detail reinforced the lesson they hadn't expected to learn tonight. Brilliance can't be contained by narrow perceptions. By the time she left the stage, they weren't just clapping. They were learning a lesson they hadn't anticipated. She reached the doors to the auditorium and paused briefly, glancing back over the room. Her eyes swept the crowd, students, parents, teachers, all of them caught in the realization that assumptions about black women in elite spaces often fail spectacularly. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her entire journey through the event, from the skeptical glares at the entrance to the commanding keynote on stage, had spoken volumes. If you've watched this far, hit subscribe and the bell icon. You won't want to miss what happens when Diane's influence ripples beyond this room. As the applause continued, conversations began to shift. Parents who had initially judged her presence were now discussing her research, the insights she had shared, and the undeniable authority she wielded. The narrative of exclusion had flipped completely. What they had assumed to be a social misfit, someone different, was in fact the most capable, accomplished individual in the room. Her keynote had done more than educate. It had disrupted entrenched biases, challenged unspoken hierarchies, and reminded everyone present that presence, intellect, and authority are not dictated by familiarity or appearance. In one evening, Diane Carter had rewritten the expectations of an entire room. Even after she exited, her influence lingered. Teachers referenced her examples in discussions. Parents retold her anecdotes at dinner tables. Students carried forward the spark of curiosity she ignited. The room that had once whispered about her not belonging was now a space that recognized her power. Not because they had to, but because it was undeniable. Every step, every word, every gesture had reminded them. Assumptions underestimate black women at their peril. Finally, the auditorium emptied, leaving only the echo of applause and the weight of realization. Diane Carter had not entered the room to prove anyone wrong. She had entered to teach, to inspire, and to show, through presence and intellect, that space and respect are earned not by conformity, but by mastery. Medium dark skin, sleek blazer, calm and poised, she walked into the night beyond the school doors, a silent testament to resilience, excellence, and the power of presence. The parents who had doubted her would remember this evening for years, not just for the knowledge she shared, but for the lesson in humility, awareness, and respect she imparted without ever raising her voice. They thought she didn't belong. They thought she wasn't enough. But Diane Carter didn't need to prove them wrong. She reminded them who truly defines the stage.